The dust-laden wind whipped at Lillian Deveraux' skirts as she stood before the empty house, her trunks and valise scattered around her feet like forgotten promises. After 6 weeks of travel from Philadelphia to Montana Territory, she had arrived at what was supposed to be her new home, her new life, only to find it abandoned. The silence more deafening than the rattling stagecoach that had dropped her at the edge of Linden with a sympathetic tip of the driver's hat. Montana Territory, 1878. Lillian had left everything behind: her position as a schoolteacher, her small apartment, her predictable life, to marry a man she knew only through letters. Jacob Wells had painted such vivid pictures with his words: a prosperous ranch, a comfortable house, a town on the verge of becoming something more than a way station for cattle drives. His proposal had arrived after 6 months of correspondence, and she had accepted, partly out of practicality, partly out of a yearning for something more than spinsterhood in a city that held no future for her. Now, as the October chill began to settle, Lillian fought back tears. The house stood like a skeleton against the vast Montana sky, windows intact but curtainless, door hanging slightly ajar as if reluctantly welcoming her. A small homestead, just as Jacob had described, but devoid of the warmth his letters had promised. "Hello." She called out, her voice thin against the expanse of prairie that surrounded the property. "Mr. Wells, Jacob," only the wind answered, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Lillian gathered her courage and approached the house, climbing the 3 wooden steps to the porch. The floorboards creaked beneath her weight, sound returning to a place that seemed to have forgotten it. She pushed the door open wider, peering into the dim interior. A table, 2 chairs, a small stove, and a narrow bed were the only furnishings. No fire in the hearth, no lamp lit in welcome. No Jacob Wells. Lillian's heart sank. Had he changed his mind? Had something happened to him? Or worse, had this all been some cruel joke at her expense? "Miss, you looking for someone?" The deep voice startled her, and she spun around, nearly losing her balance on the worn threshold. A man sat atop a dun-colored horse about 20 yards from the house. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, but she could see he was watching her intently. I'm looking for Jacob Wells," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "This is his property, is it not?" The man dismounted in a fluid motion that spoke of years in the saddle. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in the practical attire of a working cowboy: denim trousers, flannel shirt beneath a leather vest, boots dusty from the trail. As he approached, she could see his features more clearly. Strong jaw shadowed with several days' worth of beard, eyes the color of a summer storm, and a mouth that looked as though it rarely smiled. "Jacob Wells is dead, miss," he said without preamble. "Caught pneumonia last winter and didn't make it to spring." The words hit Lillian like a physical blow. Dead. How could Jacob be dead when his last letter, dated just 2 months prior, had confirmed her arrival date, when he had written of his excitement to finally meet her face to face? "There must be some mistake," she insisted, her knees suddenly weak. She gripped the doorframe for support. "I received a letter, no mistake." The man removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. "I'm Yates Porter. Jacob was my cousin. I wrote those letters." Lillian stared at him, uncomprehending. "You wrote the letters? In Jacob's name? After he died?" Yates nodded once, his expression unreadable. "I didn't know how to tell you. Jacob asked me to look after things if anything happened to him. He thought highly of you, Miss Deveraux. Said you were the most educated woman he'd ever corresponded with, so you continued the correspondence. Made me believe I was coming to marry a man who was already in his grave." Anger began to replace shock, coloring her cheeks and straightening her spine. "Do you have any idea what I gave up to come here? I resigned my teaching position. I sold nearly everything I owned. I traveled thousands of miles." Yates Porter had the decency to look ashamed, his hat now twisted in his large, calloused hands. "I know it was wrong, I just didn't know how to stop what Jacob had started. And then it seemed like the timing was never right to tell you the truth." Lillian felt light-headed. All her careful plans, all her hopes for a new beginning gone. And standing before her was the architect of her current predicament, looking more uncomfortable than genuinely sorry. "I should go," she said, though she had no idea where. The stage coach had already continued its journey west. The nearest town with a rail station was 2 days' ride away. She had exactly $4.27 to her name, until she could wire her cousin in Philadelphia for more funds, assuming her cousin would be willing to help after Lillian had proudly announced her impending marriage and new life out west. Go where? Yates asked, as if reading her thoughts. He glanced at her trunk still sitting in the yard. The next stage through Linden isn't due for 3 days. "I'll find accommodations in town," Lillian replied stiffly, though she doubted Linden, with its single street of weathered buildings, offered much in the way of proper lodgings for a lady alone. "Town's 5 miles from here," Yates said, gesturing vaguely eastward. "And there's no hotel, just rooms above the saloon. Not suitable for a woman like yourself." "A woman like myself has few options at the moment, Mr. Porter, thanks to your deception." Lillian's voice trembled with fury and fear. Yates looked back at the house, then at her, his expression softening slightly. "You could stay here. The house is yours by rights. Jacob left everything to you in his will. He was determined you would come west, even if he wasn't here to welcome you." Lillian blinked in surprise. "He left this house to me, but he never even met me." "Jacob was a man who believed in keeping his promises," Yates said simply. Then, looking around at the bare yard and weathered homestead, he added quietly, "It's not much, but seeing you standing there, this place doesn't seem so empty anymore." Lillian wasn't sure if she wanted to laugh or cry at the absurdity of it all. Here she was, standing on the threshold of a home she apparently owned, facing a man who had deceived her for months, and yet something in his eyes a flash of genuine regret. Perhaps even loneliness made her hesitate before unleashing the full force of her anger. "I don't know the first thing about surviving out here," she admitted, gesturing to the vast prairie surrounding them. "I could help," Yates offered. "My ranch is just over that ridge. Jacob and I worked our land together. I've been keeping an eye on his place since he passed." "Why would you help me?" Lillian challenged. Yates met her gaze directly. "Because I owe it to Jacob. And to you." He paused, then added softly, "And because that look on your face when you realized there was no one waiting for you. I never want to be responsible for putting that look on anyone's face again." Lillian studied him, trying to reconcile this contrite man with the one who had maintained such a terrible deception. Common sense told her to be wary, to find her way back to civilization as quickly as possible. But another part of her, the part that had dared to leave Philadelphia for the unknown, whispered that perhaps this unexpected turn was not the end of her journey, but merely a different beginning than the one she had anticipated. "I'll stay tonight," she decided. "And tomorrow I'll figure out what comes next." Yates nodded, placing his hat back on his head. "I'll bring your trunks inside, then fetch some supplies from my place. You'll need firewood, food, lamp oil." As he turned to retrieve her belongings, Lillian called after him, "Mr. Porter." He paused, glancing back at her over his shoulder. "I'm still angry with you," she informed him firmly. "Don't mistake my practical acceptance of shelter for forgiveness." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Yes, madam, I wouldn't dream of it." True to his word, Yates brought in her trunks and valise, setting them carefully in the corner of the main room. He worked efficiently, without unnecessary conversation, which suited Lillian's turbulent mood. After ensuring she had clean water from the well and showing her how to operate the cast-iron stove, he departed with a promise to return before sundown with additional provisions. Left alone, Lillian explored what was apparently now her home. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and parlor all in one, with the small bedroom separated by a door at the back. Everything was clean but Spartan, lacking the personal touches that transformed a structure into a home. No photographs, no books, no decorative items of any kind. Just the basic necessities for survival. She wondered about Jacob Wells, the man she had agreed to marry. Had he lived here alone, writing his letters by lamplight at this very table, imagining her arrival just as she had imagined it? The thought filled her with a peculiar sadness for a man she would never meet. Opening one of her trunks, Lillian removed a framed daguerreotype of her parents, both long deceased, and placed it on the mantel above the cold hearth. One small act of claiming this strange space as her own. By the time Yates returned, driving a wagon loaded with supplies, Lillian had swept the floors, wiped down all surfaces, and unpacked some of her clothing. The physical labor had helped channel her anger and confusion into something productive. "You've been busy," Yates observed as he carried in an armload of firewood. "I find work helps clear the mind," she replied, watching as he knelt to build a fire in the hearth. His movements were practiced and sure, reminding her that this was a man accustomed to self-sufficiency. "I brought some food staples," he said, nodding toward the wagon outside. "Flour, sugar, coffee, salt pork, dried beans, some canned goods, and these." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small paper package which he set on the table. "Seeds for a kitchen garden come spring." The thoughtfulness of the gesture, planning for a future season when she might still be here, caught Lillian off guard. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than she'd intended. Yates nodded, then continued bringing in the provisions he'd brought. Lillian helped him store everything away, learning where Jacob had kept things in the process. There was an awkward formality between them, neither quite knowing how to navigate this unusual situation. As twilight descended, Yates lit the lamps and stoked the fire to ensure it would burn through the night. Standing in the doorway, hat in hand, he said, "I'll come by tomorrow morning to check on you, maybe show you around the property if you'd like." "Why did you do it?" Lillian asked suddenly. The question had been burning in her mind all afternoon. "Continue writing as Jacob. What did you hope to accomplish?" Yates looked down at the floorboards, his expression troubled. "At first, I was just going to write and tell you he'd passed, but then I read your letters to him." He glanced up, meeting her accusing gaze. "I know I shouldn't have, but you wrote so eloquently about your dreams of coming west, of building a new life. And Jacob had been so happy about finding you, it seemed cruel to end that hope. So instead, you let me travel all this way to discover the truth alone, standing in front of an empty house." Lillian shook her head, incredulous. "I was going to meet the stage," Yates said, his voice tight with regret. "Tell you before you ever saw this place. But there was trouble at my ranch, a heifer having a difficult birth. By the time I got free, you were already gone from town." He paused. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Miss Deveraux, just trying to explain that I never meant for it to happen this way." Lillian wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling the chill of the approaching night. "I don't know what to make of you, Mr. Porter. Most folks around here would say the same," he replied with a self-deprecating half-smile. "I'll be back at first light. Lock the door after me." After he left, Lillian did as instructed, sliding the heavy wooden bar into place across the door. She prepared a simple meal from the provisions he'd brought, ate in solitude at the rough-hewn table, and then readied herself for bed. As she lay beneath the unfamiliar quilts, listening to the wind whisper around the eaves of her new home, Lillian wondered at the strange turn her life had taken. She had come seeking marriage, security, partnership. Instead, she found herself a widow before she was ever a bride, owner of a homestead she didn't know how to manage, dependent on the goodwill of a man whose honesty she had every reason to question. Yet despite everything, a small, stubborn part of her refused to surrender to despair or retreat back east in defeat. She had chosen this path, believing it would lead to a new chapter in her life. Perhaps it still would, just not the one she had anticipated when she boarded that train in Philadelphia 6 weeks ago. With that thought, Lillian drifted into an exhausted sleep, dreaming of open prairies and storm-colored eyes watching her from beneath the brim of a cowboy hat. True to his word, Yates returned at dawn, bringing fresh milk and eggs from his ranch. Lillian, who had been awake since the first light crept through the curtainless windows, had already rekindled the fire and put coffee on to boil. "You're up early," he noted, setting his offerings on the table. "I'm accustomed to rising with the sun," she replied, taking the milk to the small pantry at the back of the house. "In Philadelphia, I had to be at the schoolhouse by 7 o'clock to prepare for the day's lessons." "You were a teacher?" Yates asked, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. Lillian nodded. "For 5 years. I taught children from 6 to 12 years of age reading, writing, arithmetic, history, basic sciences." "No school in Linden yet," Yates said, warming his hands around the mug. "Nearest one's in Helena. Some families do their teaching at home. Others." "Well, education isn't always the priority out here." "Perhaps it should be," Lillian replied. She busied herself making a simple breakfast of fried eggs and the biscuits Yates had brought, still warm from his housekeeper's oven. "What about you, Mr. Porter? Were you educated formally?" A look of surprise crossed his face, as if he hadn't expected her interest in his background. "Yes, madam. My father insisted. Sent me back east to boarding school when I was 12. I stayed through college, studied engineering at Cornell University." Now it was Lillian's turn to be surprised. "Cornell? That's unexpected." Yates's mouth quirked in that almost smile she'd glimpsed the previous evening. "Most folks out here don't know what to make of it either. My father had ideas about me joining the railroads as they expanded west, but when he died, I came home to run the ranch instead." "Do you regret it?" Lillian asked, genuinely curious. Giving up engineering for ranching, Yates considered the question as they sat down to eat. "No," he said finally. "I'm where I'm meant to be. This land gets into your blood, hard to explain to someone who hasn't felt it." "I'd like to see it," Lillian said. "The land, I mean." "You mentioned showing me around." After breakfast, they set out on horseback, Lillian riding side saddle on a gentle mare Yates had brought for her use. She wore her most practical traveling dress, and had pinned her chestnut hair securely beneath a wide-brimmed bonnet to protect against the late autumn sun. Yates proved to be a knowledgeable guide, pointing out landmarks, identifying local plants and wildlife, explaining the natural features that made this particular valley ideal for ranching. The land that had been Jacob's, now hers, consisted of 60 acres, including a small creek that provided water year-round, grazing meadows, and a modest stand of pines that offered both shelter from the winds and a source of building materials and firewood. "It's beautiful," Lillian admitted as they paused atop a ridge that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding countryside. In the distance, she could see the cluster of buildings that made up the town of Linden, and beyond that, the blue shadows of mountains against the horizon. "I can understand why Jacob wanted to build a life here. He worked hard to make this place viable," Yates said. "Started with nothing but a tent and a dream 6 years ago. By the time he got sick, he'd built the house, fenced the north pasture, and had plans to expand his herd come spring." "And now," Lillian asked, glancing at her companion, "what happens to those plans?" Yates met her gaze steadily. "That depends on you, I reckon. The property's yours. You could sell it, plenty of folks would be interested, or you could try to make a go of it." He paused. "It wouldn't be easy for a woman alone." "No," Lillian agreed, looking back at the landscape spread before them. "I imagine it wouldn't." They continued their ride, circling back toward the homestead by a different route that took them past Yates's much larger ranch. His property featured a sprawling main house, several outbuildings, corrals filled with horses, and a bunkhouse where, he explained, his ranch hands lived. "You employ many men?" Lillian asked as they rode past the bunkhouse, where a couple of cowboys tipped their hats respectfully in her direction. "8 full-time, more during roundup and branding season," Yates replied. "Been fortunate enough to keep good men who know their business." Lillian was impressed despite herself. Clearly, Yates Porter was not merely a neighboring rancher but a successful businessman in his own right. It made his deception regarding Jacob's letters all the more puzzling. What possible motivation could a man in his position have for such a charade? As they approached a fenced garden near the main house, An older woman emerged, wiping her hands on a large apron. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a severe bun, but her round face lit up with curiosity at the sight of Lillian. "Mrs. Abernathy," Yates called in greeting. "This is Miss Lillian Deveraux. She's taken up residence at Jacob's place." The woman's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "The mail-order bride? Land's sake, Mr. Porter, why didn't you tell me she'd arrived? I'd have prepared a proper welcome basket." She bustled over to the fence, extending a work-roughened hand. "Martha Abernathy, miss. I keep house for this confirmed bachelor and make sure he doesn't waste away to nothing with his terrible cooking." Lillian shook the offered hand, warming to the woman's forthright manner. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Abernathy. You come by any time you need anything," Martha insisted. "And don't you worry about being out here alone. Mr. Porter may look like a grizzly bear, but he's got the heart of a lamb. He'll see you right." "Mrs. Abernathy," Yates interjected, his voice carrying a warning note. The housekeeper merely smiled, unfazed. "Just speaking truth, Mr. Porter." "Now, will you be bringing Miss Deveraux for supper tonight? I'm making pot roast." Before Yates could answer, Lillian said, "That's very kind, but I should become accustomed to managing on my own." Turning to Yates, she added, "If you wouldn't mind escorting me back to my property, Mr. Porter. I've imposed enough on your time today." The ride back to Lillian's homestead was quieter, both riders lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the house, which looked somehow less forlorn in the golden afternoon light than it had the previous day, Lillian broke the silence. "Mr. Porter, I appreciate your assistance, but I need to be clear about something." Yates slowed his horse, giving her his full attention. "I came here expecting to be a wife," Lillian continued, choosing her words carefully. "That's no longer possible given the circumstances. But I still need a purpose, a way to support myself." "You're thinking of selling and returning east?" Yates asked, his expression carefully neutral. "No," Lillian surprised herself with the certainty in her voice. "At least not immediately. I've always believed that when life presents unexpected challenges, there's an opportunity hidden within them." She straightened in her saddle. "I think I'd like to open a school in Linden." Yates stared at her for a moment, then broke into the first genuine smile she'd seen from him, a transformation that softened his rugged features and crinkled the corners of those storm-gray eyes. "A school," he repeated. "Well, Miss Deveraux, that's a fine idea. The town could certainly use one." "Would families support it, do you think?" Lillian asked. "Those with children would," Yates affirmed. "And those without might contribute anyway if they have vision for what the town could become. Linden's growing. The railroad's planning to extend a spur line through by next summer. Proper schooling would be a drawing point for families considering settling here." "I would need to secure a building, of course," Lillian mused, her mind already racing with plans. "And supplies, books. I might have some suggestions," Yates offered as they dismounted in front of her house. "If you'd permit me to assist." Lillian studied him, still wary but beginning to see beyond the deception that had brought her here. "Why would you help me, Mr. Porter, beyond your sense of obligation to your cousin?" Yates removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a sign he was carefully considering his words. "Because education matters," he said finally. "And because I think you're exactly what Linden needs, someone with vision and determination. Someone not afraid to build something new." His sincere answer touched something in Lillian. For the first time since learning of Jacob's death, she felt a spark of genuine hope for her future in this wild, beautiful place. "Thank you for today," she said, "for showing me the land. And for not dismissing my idea out of hand." "I wouldn't dare," Yates replied, a hint of that smile returning. "Something tells me you're not a woman easily deterred once you've set your mind to something." "No," Lillian agreed, "I'm not." As Yates mounted his horse to leave, he paused. "I'll be by tomorrow, if that's all right. There are some repairs needed on your roof before winter sets in properly." "I would appreciate that," Lillian said. Then, making a sudden decision, she added, "And perhaps you might stay for supper afterward, as a thank you." Something flickered in Yates's eyes, surprise, certainly, but also a warmth that hadn't been there before. "I'd like that, Miss Deveraux." As she watched him ride away, Lillian felt an unexpected lightness in her chest. Her arrival in Montana territory had not been at all what she had anticipated. But perhaps, just perhaps, it could still lead to the fulfilling life she had dared to dream about during those long nights in Philadelphia when Jacob's letters had opened a window to a different world. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with the promise of a beautiful autumn day. Lillian rose early, determined to begin establishing a routine in her new home. After breakfast, she tackled the task of making the house more livable, hanging the few curtains she had brought from Philadelphia, arranging her books on a crude shelf Yates had pointed out the day before, and finding places for her personal belongings. By mid-morning, the homestead already felt more like a place where someone actually lived, rather than the empty shell that had greeted her upon arrival. Satisfied with her progress, Lillian decided to explore the immediate surroundings on foot, wanting to familiarize herself with every aspect of her new property. The small barn behind the house was in good repair, though currently empty of livestock. Inside, she found a workbench with neatly arranged tools, sacks of feed for animals that were no longer there, and a stall with fresh straw, presumably where Yates had been keeping the mare she had ridden the previous day. Beyond the barn stretched a fallow field, where Jacob had likely grown vegetables or perhaps grain for his own use. Lillian made a mental note to ask Yates about what might be practical for her to plant come spring. While she had grown up helping in her mother's kitchen garden, farming on any scale was well outside her experience. As she circled back toward the house, Lillian spotted a rider approaching from the direction of town. For a moment, she thought it might be Yates arriving earlier than expected, but as the figure drew closer, she could see it was someone else entirely, a woman, riding astride rather than side saddle, dressed in practical riding clothes. The stranger reined in her horse a respectful distance from the house and called out, "Hello there! You must be the bride we've all been hearing about." Lillian approached, curiosity overcoming her initial wariness. The woman appeared to be in her early 30s, with auburn hair escaping from a practical braid and keen hazel eyes that assessed Lillian with friendly interest. "I'm Lillian Deveraux," she confirmed. "Though I'm afraid I'm not actually a bride. There was a misunderstanding." The woman dismounted with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime on horseback. "Rebecca Thornton," she introduced herself, extending a gloved hand. "I own the general store in Linden, and don't worry, we've all heard about Jacob. Such a shame, he was a good man. You knew him well?" Lillian asked, leading Rebecca toward the house. "As well as anyone, I suppose. Linden's not exactly a metropolis everyone knows everyone's business." Rebecca smiled, softening what might have sounded like criticism. "Jacob was quiet, hardworking. Came to town for supplies twice a month like clockwork. Started ordering writing paper and better ink about a year ago. That's when the rumors started that he was corresponding with a potential bride." Inside the house, Lillian put coffee on to boil while Rebecca settled at the table, removing her gloves and hat. "I hope you don't mind my calling unannounced," Rebecca said. "But when Yates Porter rode into town yesterday afternoon looking for roofing materials and mentioned you were planning to open a school, I couldn't resist coming to meet you." "Mr. Porter was in town?" Lillian asked, surprised. Rebecca nodded. "Talking to half the business owners about supporting your school. He can be quite persuasive when he puts his mind to something." Lillian felt a rush of gratitude toward Yates. He hadn't merely offered empty words of support, he was actively advocating for her idea. "And what do you think of a school for Linden?" she asked, serving the coffee. "I think it's exactly what we need," Rebecca replied emphatically. "I have 2 children myself. Thomas is 10 and Sarah's 8. Currently, they learn what they can from me and their father in the evenings, but it's hardly adequate. There are at least a dozen other children in town and on nearby farms who would benefit. Where would be the best location?" Lillian asked, Her excitement growing as she realized her vision might actually be achievable, Rebecca considered. There's a vacant building next to the church. It was originally intended as a meeting hall, but it's mostly used for storage now. With some work, it could serve as a schoolhouse. The two women spent the next hour discussing practical considerations for establishing a school in Linden. Rebecca proved to be a wealth of information about the town and its residents, providing Lillian with a much clearer picture of the community she was hoping to serve. "You should come into town with me," Rebecca suggested as they finished their coffee. "Meet some of the families, see the potential schoolhouse for yourself. I'm heading back after I make deliveries to a couple of outlying farms." Lillian hesitated, glancing out the window. "I'm expecting Mr. Porter this afternoon. He's coming to repair the roof." A knowing smile played at the corners of Rebecca's mouth. "I see. Well, Yates is a man of his word. If he said he'd be here, he will be even if you're not, but I understand if you'd prefer to wait." "It's not that," Lillian protested quickly. "It's just that I promised him supper as thanks for his assistance." "Ah," Rebecca said, her smile widening. "Yates Porter having supper with a lady. Now that's something the Linden gossips will enjoy chewing on." "It's nothing like that," Lillian insisted, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "Mr. Porter has been kind enough to help me get settled, that's all." "Of course," Rebecca agreed, though her expression remained amused. "Well, my invitation stands. If not today, perhaps later this week. I could introduce you around town, help you get established." "I would like that very much," Lillian said sincerely. "Thank you." After Rebecca departed, promising to return in a few days, Lillian found herself smiling. She had made her first friend in Linden a potential ally in her quest to establish a school. And according to Rebecca, Yates was already garnering support for her endeavor among the town's business owners. Speaking of Yates, Lillian realized she needed to prepare for his arrival. She had promised him supper, and while her cooking skills were adequate, they were better suited to a Philadelphia kitchen than a frontier homestead. Still, she was determined to provide a decent meal in return for his assistance. Consulting the provisions he had brought, Lillian decided on a simple but hearty stew, setting it to simmer early so the flavors would develop properly. She also mixed dough for biscuits, leaving it to rest until closer to mealtime. Just after noon, Yates arrived with a wagon loaded with roofing materials, tools, and a few additional items for the house. "Hope I'm not too early," he said as he climbed down from the wagon. "Wanted to get started while there's plenty of daylight." "Not at all," Lillian assured him. "I've been keeping busy." A neighbor visited this morning, Rebecca Thornton from the general store. Yates nodded, unloading materials from the wagon. "Rebecca's good people. Her husband Thomas runs the livery in town. Did she mention I spoke to some folks about your school idea?" "She did," Lillian confirmed, helping him carry lighter items to the house. "She said you were quite persuasive." A hint of color touched Yates's tan cheeks. "Just told them the truth that a proper school would benefit the whole community." Most were receptive, particularly Reverend Simmons. "He's been trying to convince someone to start a Sunday school for years." "Rebecca mentioned a building near the church that might serve," Lillian said. "That's the one," Yates agreed. "It would need work, new floor, better windows, proper desks, but the structure's sound." He glanced at her. "I could help with the renovations if you decide to go ahead." "You've already done so much," Lillian protested. Yates shrugged, adjusting his hat against the midday sun. "I like having projects, keeps me from spending too much time alone with my thoughts." There was something in his tone, a hint of old pain, perhaps that made Lillian wonder what memories he preferred to avoid. But before she could formulate a tactful question, Yates had moved on to explaining the work needed on her roof. "There's a weak spot above the bedroom," he said, pointing to an area where the shingles appeared darker than the rest. "Water damage from last spring's heavy rains. If we don't fix it before winter, you'll have snow melting through your ceiling come the first thaw." Lillian questioned. Yates gave her that half-smile that was becoming familiar. "Well, I'll do the roof work. but you can hand up materials when I need them, save me climbing up and down the ladder every 5 minutes." And so they spent the afternoon working together, Lillian following Yates's instructions as he replaced damaged shingles and reinforced weak spots in the roof structure. Despite the physical labor, there was an easy rhythm to their cooperation, punctuated by conversation that flowed more naturally than during their previous interactions. Yates told her about life on his ranch, the seasonal rhythms of calving, branding, and roundup, the challenges of harsh winters and occasional drought, the satisfaction of seeing a herd thrive under proper management. Lillian, in turn, shared stories from her teaching career in Philadelphia, the children who had passed through her classroom, and her growing conviction that education was her true calling. "You're good at explaining things," Yates observed as he demonstrated how to properly seal the roof against weather. "Natural teacher." "I've always loved helping others learn," Lillian admitted. "Even as a child, I would gather neighborhood children and play school, making them recite their letters and numbers before they could join in other games." "Strict disciplinarian from the start, eh?" Yates teased, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Lillian laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that surprised them both. "I prefer to think of it as setting high standards." By late afternoon, the roof repairs were complete, and Yates had also fixed a loose floorboard on the porch, adjusted the door that had been hanging crookedly, and checked the chimney to ensure it was drawing properly for winter use. While he cleaned up his tools, Lillian put the finishing touches on their meal, setting the small table with her mother's china, one of the few family heirlooms she had brought west. "Something smells wonderful," Yates said as he entered the house after washing up at the outdoor pump. "Just a simple stew," Lillian replied, suddenly self-conscious about the modest offering. "And biscuits." "Nothing simple about a good stew," Yates contradicted, taking the seat she indicated. "It's been a while since I've had a home-cooked meal that didn't come from Mrs. Abernathy's kitchen." They ate by the warm light of oil lamps, the autumn evening having brought an early dusk. Conversation flowed surprisingly easily, with none of the awkward silences Lillian had feared. Yates proved to be a thoughtful dinner companion, asking questions about her life in Philadelphia and sharing stories about the early days of Linden when the town was little more than a trading post. "How did you end up here?" Lillian asked as they lingered over coffee. "You mentioned studying engineering at Cornell. That's a long way from ranching in Montana territory." Yates's expression grew more serious. "My father established the ranch while I was away at school. He had a vision for what this land could become, not just a place to raise cattle, but a community. A future." He traced the rim of his coffee cup with one finger, lost in memory. "When I graduated, I had offers from several railroad companies back east, good positions, respectable salaries, but my father wrote asking me to come home first to see what he'd built before I made my decision." He fell silent for a moment, and Lillian waited patiently, sensing there was more to the story. "I arrived to find him dying," Yates continued quietly. "Pneumonia, same as took Jacob later. He held on just long enough to extract a promise from me that I'd give the ranch a fair chance before selling it off to strangers." A sad smile touched his lips. "He knew me too well, knew once I spent time here I'd never want to leave. And he was right," Lillian said softly. Yates nodded, meeting her gaze across the table. "There's something about this land, the openness of it, the challenge. Every morning brings something new, some problem to solve, some beauty to witness. It gets into your blood in a way that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it." "I think I'm beginning to understand," Lillian said, surprising herself with the realization that it was true. In just a few days, the vastness that had initially seemed so intimidating had begun to feel like freedom instead. After supper, they moved to the small sitting area near the hearth, where Yates helped Lillian position 2 chairs she had brought from Philadelphia, the only truly comfortable seating in the house. "These didn't come by stagecoach," he observed, running an appreciative hand over the well-crafted upholstery. No, Lillian smiled. I had them shipped ahead by rail to Helena, then freighted to Linden. They were my grandmother's. I couldn't bear to part with them. It was wise to bring some comforts, Yates approved. Makes the transition easier. As they sat before the fire, the conversation turned to more practical matters: what Lillian would need to prepare for winter, how to manage the property until she decided its ultimate fate, the possibilities for the school in town. I should head back, Yates said eventually, glancing at the darkness beyond the windows. It's a fair ride to my place, and these autumn nights get cold quickly. At the door, he paused, turning back to Lillian. I brought something for you, he said, reaching into his coat pocket. Found it among Jacob's things after he passed. Thought you should have it. He handed her a small, worn book bound in faded leather. Opening it, Lillian discovered it was a journal filled with Jacob's neat handwriting. Flipping through the pages, she saw descriptions of daily life on the homestead, plans for improvements, and toward the end, references to the letters he had begun exchanging with a schoolteacher from Philadelphia. I think he kept it from the day he arrived here, Yates explained. Sort of a record of building his dream. Lillian's throat tightened with emotion for this man she had never met, whose life had intertwined with hers through words on paper. Thank you, she whispered. This means a great deal to me. I thought it might help you understand why he wanted you to come here, Yates said, even knowing the challenges. Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a shared understanding, perhaps, of what it meant to pursue a dream despite uncertainty. Good night, Miss Deveraux, Yates said, settling his hat on his head. Lillian, she corrected impulsively. After all you've done to help me, I think we've moved beyond such formality, at least when it's just the two of us. A slow smile spread across his face, the full, genuine one that transformed his features. Good night, Lillian. I'll see you soon. As she watched him ride away into the darkness, Lillian felt a curious mixture of emotions. Gratitude for his assistance, certainly. Lingering anger at his deception, yes. But also something new, a warmth that had nothing to do with practicality or obligation, and everything to do with the man himself. Closing the door against the night chill, Lillian returned to her chair by the fire, opening Jacob's journal to the first page. If she was to make this place her home, even temporarily, she wanted to understand the vision that had brought it into being. Over the following weeks, Lillian settled into life in Montana territory with a determination that surprised even her. Each day brought new challenges and learning experiences, but also a growing sense of capability and independence. Yates visited regularly, sometimes to assist with repairs or improvements to the homestead, other times simply to check that she had everything she needed. He brought her into town to meet more of Linden's residents, introduced her to the town council, and helped her make arrangements to use the building near the church as a schoolhouse. The proposed school was met with enthusiasm by most of the community, particularly families with children. A few of the older, more conservative residents expressed skepticism about a city woman teaching their children. But Lillian addressed their concerns with such confidence and clarity that most were won over. By the end of October, plans were well underway to open Linden's first proper school after the new year. You've accomplished more in 3 weeks than most newcomers do in their first year, Rebecca commented one afternoon as she helped Lillian inventory the school supplies that had been donated or purchased. The empty building was gradually being transformed into a functional classroom, with Yates and several other men from town providing labor for the necessary renovations. I've had a great deal of help, Lillian pointed out, watching through the window as Yates installed a new window pane, his movements precise and efficient. Everyone has been incredibly supportive. Rebecca murmured, following Lillian's gaze with a knowing smile. Particularly our local rancher. You know, in all the years I've known Yates Porter, I've never seen him spend so much time in town, or smile so much for that matter. Lillian felt heat rise to her cheeks. Mr. Porter feels responsible for my situation, that's all. He's being kind. "If you say so," Rebecca replied, clearly unconvinced. "But I've known Yates since we were children. Kindness and obligation only explain so much of his behavior." Before Lillian could formulate a response, the door opened and Yates himself entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. "Windows fixed," he reported. "No more drafts to worry about, and Tom Hendricks says he'll have the desks ready by the end of next week." "That's wonderful news," Lillian said, genuinely pleased. "We're nearly ready for students." "Speaking of which," Rebecca interjected, "I should head back to the store. Thomas is watching it for me, and he's likely to give away more than he sells if left unsupervised too long." She gathered her shawl, gave Lillian a significant look that Yates couldn't see, and departed with a cheerful wave. "Rebecca's been a good friend to you," Yates observed, helping Lillian organize the newly arrived textbooks on a shelf he had built the previous week. "She has," Lillian agreed. "I don't know what I would have done without her guidance. Or yours," she added softly. Yates paused in his task, turning to face her. "You'd have managed," he said with quiet confidence. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Lillian." The way he said her name with a warmth that seemed reserved for her alone sent a flutter through her chest that was becoming increasingly familiar. Over the past weeks, as anger and distrust had given way to understanding and friendship, Lillian had found herself looking forward to Yates's visits with an eagerness that both thrilled and frightened her. "I have something to show you," Yates said, changing the subject. "If you're done here for the day, curious," Lillian agreed, and soon they were riding side by side out of town, following a trail that led toward the mountains visible in the distance. The late October afternoon was crisp but pleasant, the sun casting a golden light over the autumn landscape. "Where are we going?" Lillian asked as they left the familiar surroundings of Linden behind. "You'll see," Yates replied, that hint of a smile playing at his lips. "It's one of my favorite places. Thought you might appreciate it too." After about an hour's ride, they reached a small, sheltered valley nestled among pine-covered foothills. A clear stream meandered through the center, its banks lined with cottonwoods whose leaves had turned brilliant gold in the autumn chill. Beyond the valley, the mountains rose in majestic tiers, their peaks already dusted with the first snow of the season. "Oh," Lillian breathed, reining in her horse to take in the view. "It's beautiful." Yates dismounted, then moved to help her down from her mare. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary before he stepped back, gesturing toward a flat-topped boulder near the stream. "Best seat in the house," he said. They settled side by side on the sun-warmed stone, the burble of the stream providing a soothing backdrop to their conversation. Yates pointed out features of the landscape, naming the peaks on the horizon, explaining how this valley transformed with each season. "In spring, this whole area is covered in wildflowers," he told her. "By summer, the grass grows tall enough to hide a standing man, and in winter, when everything's blanketed in snow, it's so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat." "You truly love this land," Lillian observed, watching his face as he described it. "I do," Yates confirmed. "Took me a while to appreciate it fully. When I first returned from the East, all I saw were the hardships, the isolation, the backbreaking work required just to survive." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the panorama before them. "But then one day I rode up here, just as the sun was setting. The light hit those mountains just so, and suddenly I understood what my father had seen all along, the promise of this place. The freedom." Lillian nodded, beginning to understand. In Philadelphia, her life had been circumscribed by societal expectations, by the limited opportunities available to a woman of her station. Here, despite the physical challenges, there was a sense of possibility that she had never experienced before. "I've been reading Jacob's journal," she said after a comfortable silence had stretched between them. "He wrote about this valley too, said it was where he came to think when decisions needed making." Yates nodded. "We discovered it together our first year here. Came up hunting and got caught in a thunderstorm, found shelter in that stand of pines over there." He pointed to a dense cluster of trees at the far end of the valley. By the time the storm passed, it was nearly dark. We made camp and the next morning woke to this view. A fond smile touched his lips at the memory. Jacob said it was worth getting soaked to the skin. You were close, Lillian said. It wasn't a question, like brothers, Yates confirmed. We grew up together back in Ohio. When my father moved west to start the ranch, Jacob came along to help. Later, when I returned after college, he was my right hand, especially in those early days when I barely knew one end of a cow from the other. He shook his head ruefully. Engineering school doesn't prepare you much for calving season. Is that why you continued writing as him? Lillian asked gently. Because you felt you owed him something? Yates was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. Partly, he admitted finally, but also because he spoke of you so often with such hope. The letters you wrote him, he would read parts aloud sometimes. Said you had a way with words that made him see Philadelphia as clearly as if he'd been there himself. He glanced at her, his expression troubled. When he got sick, he made me promise to make sure you were taken care of one way or another. I think he knew even then that he wasn't going to recover. So you decided to bring me west anyway, Lillian said, even knowing there would be no marriage waiting for me. I told myself it was fulfilling my promise to Jacob, Yates said, meeting her gaze directly. But the truth is, I was curious about the woman whose letters had brought my friend so much joy. I wanted to meet you, to see if you were everything he believed you to be. A rueful smile touched his lips. I just didn't plan on how it would feel, watching you stand there in front of an empty house, realizing you'd been deceived. The pain in his voice was so genuine that Lillian found her remaining anger melting away. It was a terrible shock, she acknowledged. But I've had time to think about it, to understand why you did what you did, and despite everything, I'm glad I came. Yates's eyebrows rose in surprise. You are, Lillian nodded, surprised at how true the statement was. In Philadelphia, I was just one of countless unmarried teachers, destined for a life of respectable poverty and gradually diminishing opportunities. Here I can build something meaningful. The school, yes, but also a life of my own choosing. You're an extraordinary woman, Lillian Deveraux, Yates said softly. Something in his tone made her heart quicken. She turned to find him watching her with an intensity that sent warmth spreading through her despite the cooling evening air. Thank you for bringing me here, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, for sharing this place with me. I wanted you to see it, Yates replied, equally quiet, to understand why Jacob loved it here, why I do. Their eyes held for a long moment, and Lillian was suddenly acutely aware of how close they were sitting, of the fading light that cast his strong features in soft relief, of the subtle scent of leather and pine that seemed to cling to him. The moment was broken by a distant rumble of thunder. Yates glanced at the sky, where clouds were beginning to gather on the western horizon. We should head back, he said reluctantly. Storm's coming in faster than I expected. They rode swiftly, trying to outpace the approaching weather, but were only halfway to Lillian's homestead when the first fat raindrops began to fall. Within minutes, the gentle shower had become a downpour, and Yates signaled for them to take shelter beneath a stand of trees just off the trail. It might pass quickly, he said, helping Lillian dismount. These autumn storms sometimes blow through in an hour or so, but as the minutes ticked by, the rain showed no signs of abating. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed by booming thunder that made the horses stamp nervously. Yates secured the animals more firmly, then joined Lillian where she stood huddled against a massive pine trunk, seeking what protection its branches offered. You're shivering, he observed, concern evident in his voice. Just a bit cold, Lillian admitted. Her riding habit, though practical, wasn't designed for such weather. Without hesitation, Yates removed his oilskin coat and draped it around her shoulders. The garment was still warm from his body, and Lillian pulled it closer, grateful for both the physical warmth and the gesture behind it. What about you? She asked, noting that his flannel shirt was already growing damp. I'm fine, Yates assured her, though she could see goosebumps rising on his forearms. Used to much worse. They stood side by side, watching the rain turn the world around them into a blur of gray and green. Despite the discomfort, there was something oddly intimate about sharing this moment, just the two of them, isolated by the weather, protected by the ancient pines. I never thanked you properly, Lillian said suddenly, for everything you've done since I arrived. The house, the school, introducing me to everyone in town. No thanks necessary, Yates replied, his voice low. After what I put you through with those letters, it was the least I could do. Still, Lillian persisted, turning to face him more directly. You've gone far beyond obligation, Yates. You've been a friend when I needed one most. Something flickered in his eyes at the word friend, a brief shadow that might have been disappointment. I've enjoyed getting to know you, Lillian. Seeing this place through your eyes has reminded me of what makes it special. A gust of wind drove the rain sideways, spattering them despite the shelter of the trees. Lillian moved instinctively closer to Yates, and he lifted an arm, drawing her against his side in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. Sorry, he murmured, though he made no move to release her. Just trying to keep you dry. Lillian knew she should step away, that propriety demanded at least a token protest, but she remained where she was, acutely aware of the solid warmth of him against her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his arm curved around her as if it belonged there. Lillian, Yates said, his voice rough with some emotion she couldn't quite identify. I need to tell you something. She looked up at him, raindrops clinging to her eyelashes, and found him watching her with such intensity that her breath caught in her throat. When you first arrived, I told myself I was helping you out of obligation to Jacob, he continued. But that's not true anymore, hasn't been for some time. He paused, seeming to search for the right words. I look forward to every moment I spend with you. I find myself thinking about you when we're apart, planning things to show you, stories to share with you, ways to make you smile. Lillian's heart pounded against her ribs as she realized what he was saying. Yates, I know it's too soon, he interrupted gently. I know you came here expecting to marry someone else, that you might still be grieving what could have been, but I needed you to know. He took a deep breath. I'm falling in love with you, Lillian Deveraux, and I'm terrified it will ruin everything we've built. The raw honesty in his declaration left Lillian speechless. For weeks, she had been fighting her growing attraction to him, telling herself it was merely gratitude, or perhaps the natural result of his being the first friendly face in a strange place. But standing here in the rain, sheltered by his arm, looking into those storm-gray eyes, she could no longer deny the truth. It won't ruin anything, she whispered, reaching up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. Because I think I'm falling in love with you too. For a heartbeat, Yates remained perfectly still, as if afraid any movement might shatter this moment. Then, slowly, he lowered his head until his forehead rested against hers. Are you certain? He asked, his voice barely audible above the drumming of the rain. Because if this is just gratitude or confusion, it's neither, Lillian assured him. What I feel for you, it's nothing like what I imagined feeling for Jacob. It's real, Yates, present, based on knowing you, not just your words on paper. With infinite care, as if she might break or disappear, Yates cradled her face in his hands. His eyes searched hers, looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation. Finding none, he closed the remaining distance between them, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both tender and fierce, a perfect reflection of the man himself. Lillian had been kissed before, chaste, proper goodbyes from young men who had courted her briefly in Philadelphia. Nothing had prepared her for this. For the way Yates's kiss seemed to awaken every nerve in her body, for the rightness of his arms around her, for the soft sound that escaped her throat as he deepened the contact. When they finally broke apart, both breathing harder than the moment warranted, Yates rested his forehead against hers once more. I've wanted to do that since I watched you standing in front of that empty house, he confessed. looking so lost but still so determined. "I'm glad you waited," Lillian replied with a small smile. "I might have slapped you then." Yates laughed, a rich, warm sound she was hearing more frequently these days. Probably deserved it too. They remained wrapped in each other's arms, the storm forgotten, until a break in the clouds allowed weak sunlight to penetrate their shelter. Only then did they reluctantly separate, though Yates kept her hand firmly in his as they prepared to continue their journey. The ride back to Lillian's homestead was filled with a new awareness between them, stolen glances, brushing hands as they rode side by side. Shared smiles that held promises neither was quite ready to voice aloud. At her door, Yates drew her into his arms once more, kissing her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "I should go," he said reluctantly, "but I'll be back tomorrow. There's more I want to say, when we're both dry and have had time to think clearly." Lillian nodded, understanding his caution even as part of her wanted to pull him inside, to continue discovering this new, exhilarating connection between them. "Tomorrow," she agreed. As she watched him ride away, Lillian felt a sense of peace settle over her. The path that had brought her to Montana territory had been winding and unexpected, but standing here now on the porch of what truly felt like her home, for the first time she couldn't regret a single step of the journey. True to his word, Yates returned the following day, arriving just as Lillian was finishing her morning chores. The storm had cleared overnight, leaving behind a world washed clean, the autumn colors more vivid against the backdrop of a cloudless blue sky. They walked together along the creek that marked the boundary of her property, hands occasionally brushing but not quite clasping, both aware that the declarations made in the storm's shelter needed to be examined in the clear light of day. "I meant what I said yesterday," Yates finally broke the comfortable silence between them. "About my feelings for you." "As did I," Lillian assured him, stopping to face him directly. "But I think we both know there's more to consider than just our feelings." Yates nodded, his expression serious. "You came here for a specific purpose, to marry Jacob, yes, but also to build a life, to contribute to a community. I don't want to interfere with that." "You haven't," Lillian said softly. "If anything, you've made it possible. Without your help, I might have given up and returned east by now." "And the school, your plans to teach?" "Those haven't changed," Lillian confirmed. "I still believe education is vital for Lyndon's future, and it gives me purpose, a way to use my skills." Yates took her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "I would never ask you to give that up. Whatever develops between us, I want it to add to your life, not diminish it in any way." The sincerity in his voice touched Lillian deeply. In Philadelphia, most of the men who had shown interest in her had assumed she would abandon teaching once married, content to become a wife and mother exclusively. Yates's acceptance of her ambitions, his active support of them, was yet another reason her heart had turned toward him. "There's something else we should discuss," she said, summoning her courage. "The circumstances of my arrival, the deception about Jacob's letters." Pain flashed across Yates's features. "I will regret that for the rest of my days," he said quietly. "Can you ever truly forgive me for it?" Lillian considered the question seriously, knowing her answer would shape whatever future they might build together. "I believe I already have," she said finally. "Not because what you did was right, it wasn't, but because I understand why you did it. And because the man I've come to know over these past weeks is someone of integrity, who made a mistake out of loyalty and compassion, not malice." Relief washed over Yates's face, followed by a tenderness that made Lillian's breath catch. "You are remarkable," he said, raising her hand to his lips in a gesture both old-fashioned and deeply sincere. "And I promise you this, no more secrets, no more well-intentioned deceptions, just truth between us always." "I would like that," Lillian smiled. "Truth and trust." They continued walking, hands now firmly entwined, discussing what this new understanding between them might mean practically. Yates was concerned about Lillian's reputation in the community if their relationship progressed too quickly after her arrival as another man's intended bride. Lillian, while appreciative of his consideration, was less worried. The circumstances of her coming to Linden were well known, and most of the townspeople had welcomed her with open minds and hearts. Besides, she pointed out as they made their way back toward the house, it's not as if we're announcing an engagement tomorrow. We have time to let people adjust to seeing us together in this new light. Yates's step faltered slightly at the mention of engagement, and Lillian immediately regretted her choice of words. I didn't mean to presume, she began, but Yates interrupted her with a gentle squeeze of her hand. You didn't, he assured her. It's just that. Well, I've thought about it. More than I probably should admit at this stage. The confession was accompanied by a sheepish smile that made him look younger, more vulnerable. But you're right, we have time to see where this leads us. As they reached the house, Lillian was struck by how different it looked to her now compared to that first day, no longer empty and forlorn, but gradually becoming a true home, filled with her belongings, her touches, and increasingly memories of moments shared with Yates. I brought something for you, Yates said as they settled on the porch, the late morning sun warming the wooden boards beneath them. From his saddlebag, he produced a small, carefully wrapped package. Lillian opened it to find a brass teacher's bell, its handle polished to a bright shine. For the school, Yates explained. Every teacher needs a proper way to call students to attention. Touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift, Lillian impulsively leaned forward and kissed him a brief, sweet contact that nonetheless left them both slightly breathless. Thank you, she said. It's perfect. The days that followed established a new pattern to their relationship. Yates continued to help with preparations for the school, which was scheduled to open in early January after the holiday season. Lillian divided her time between organizing educational materials, getting to know the families whose children would be her students, and learning to manage her homestead with increasing confidence. Several times a week, Yates would join her for supper at her home or invite her to dine at his ranch, where Mrs. Abernathy made no attempt to hide her approval of the developing relationship. They rode together, exploring more of the countryside around Linden, and in the evenings often sat reading by the fire, comfortable in each other's company even in silence. Their physical relationship progressed with cautious tenderness, kisses that grew increasingly passionate, embraces that lingered longer each time, touches that promised more when they were ready. Yates was unfailingly respectful of Lillian's boundaries, never pressuring or rushing her, though the desire between them was unmistakable and mutual. As November gave way to December, bringing the first significant snowfall of the season, preparations for Christmas occupied much of the community's attention. Linden might be small, but its residents embraced the holiday with enthusiasm, planning a town-wide celebration that would include a special church service, a communal feast, and various entertainments. The children have been asking if you'll help them prepare a Christmas pageant, Rebecca told Lillian one afternoon as they worked together in the nearly completed schoolhouse. Even though school hasn't officially started yet, they're eager to have something to perform at the celebration. That's a wonderful idea, Lillian agreed, immediately envisioning how such a project could help her connect with her future students. We could use the schoolhouse for rehearsals, perhaps some simple scenes from the Nativity story with carols between them. By the following week, Lillian found herself surrounded by excited children 3 afternoons a week, guiding them through rehearsals with a patience and enthusiasm that confirmed her calling as a teacher. Many parents came to watch, offering to help with costumes or simple props, and Lillian used the opportunity to discuss her plans for the school curriculum in the coming year. You've won them over completely, Yates observed one evening as he walked Lillian home after a particularly successful rehearsal. Even old Mr. Simmons, who was convinced no Eastern lady could understand the needs of frontier children. Lillian laughed, her breath forming clouds in the cold December air. Mr. Simmons just needed to see that I don't intend to turn his grandsons into dandies. Once I explained that practical mathematics and geography would be emphasized alongside literature and history, he became quite supportive. As they reached her house, now snug against the winter cold thanks to additional improvements Yates had helped implement, he drew her close against the chill wind that had picked up as darkness fell. "You belong here," he said softly, his words carrying a weight beyond their simple meaning. "As if you were always meant to be part of Linden." Lillian leaned into his embrace, finding the familiar warmth and security that had become essential to her happiness. "It feels that way to me too," she admitted. "As if all the steps that led me here, even the painful or confusing ones, were necessary to bring me where I belong." Yates's arms tightened around her, his chin resting on the top of her head. "Lillian," he began, his voice carrying an unusual note of uncertainty, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you." She looked up at him, seeing the seriousness in his expression despite the gathering darkness. "What is it?" But before he could continue, they were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, a rider coming fast down the road toward them. Yates instinctively positioned himself slightly in front of Lillian, his posture alert until the rider came into view. One of his ranch hands, Tom Bradley, looking anxious. "Mr. Porter," Tom called as he reined in his horse. "Been looking all over for you, sir." "There's trouble at the ranch fire in the south barn. Mrs. Abernathy sent me to find you." Yates's expression immediately shifted to one of concern. "Anyone hurt?" "No, sir. Got all the horses out safe, but the men are having a hard time containing it. Wind's picking up." Yates turned to Lillian, conflict clear in his eyes. "I have to go." "Of course you do," she assured him, stepping back to allow him to mount his horse, which was tethered nearby. "Be careful." He leaned down from the saddle to brush a quick kiss across her lips. "I'll come by tomorrow, let you know what happened. Don't worry." As she watched the two men gallop away into the darkness, Lillian sent up a silent prayer for their safety and that of everyone at the Porter Ranch. Only after they had disappeared from sight did she realize that Yates had never completed his question, the one that had put that rare look of uncertainty in his eyes. The fire at the Porter Ranch proved to be less devastating than initially feared. Thanks to quick action by the ranch hands and assistance from neighboring properties, the blaze was contained to a single structure, with no loss of life among either people or livestock. Still, the damage required Yates's full attention for several days, leaving Lillian to wonder about the unasked question that had been interrupted. When he finally appeared at her door 3 days later, the weariness in his face was evident despite his smile at seeing her. "Sorry it took so long," he said as she welcomed him inside out of the biting December cold. "Had to secure temporary shelter for the horses until we can rebuild, and with this weather." "You don't need to apologize," Lillian assured him, taking his coat and hat. "I'm just glad everyone is safe." "Rebecca told me what happened, a lantern knocked over by one of the new colts." Yates nodded, gratefully accepting the cup of hot coffee she offered. "Young stallion got spooked by something, broke his tether. Could have been much worse if Matthews hadn't noticed the smoke so quickly." They settled by the fire, Lillian listening as Yates detailed the damage and his plans for rebuilding when the weather permitted. As he spoke, she studied him, the fatigue evident in the set of his shoulders, the shadows beneath his eyes suggesting he had slept little since the fire. "You're exhausted," she observed when he paused. "Have you rested at all?" A rueful smile crossed his face. "Not much. Too many decisions to make, arrangements for the displaced horses, calming Mrs. Abernathy, who's convinced this is some sort of omen." "An omen?" Lillian questioned. Yates shook his head, a hint of amusement breaking through his weariness. "She has ideas about what I was planning to ask you before Tom interrupted us. Says the fire was divine intervention, giving me time to do it properly." Lillian's heart quickened at the confirmation that he had indeed been about to ask something significant. "And what does Mrs. Abernathy think you should be asking me?" she inquired, trying to keep her tone light despite the sudden flutter of anticipation in her chest. Yates set down his coffee cup, turning to face her more directly. For a moment, he simply looked at her, his expression a mixture of tenderness and uncertainty that made him appear younger, less sure of himself than the capable rancher she had come to know. "I had it all planned," he said finally. "What I was going to say, how I was going to say it, even had something to give you." He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet pouch. "But maybe Mrs. Abernathy was right. Maybe it is better to do this properly." Rising from his chair, Yates moved to kneel before Lillian, taking her hands in his. The gesture was so unexpected, so traditionally romantic coming from this pragmatic man, that Lillian felt tears spring to her eyes. "Lillian Deveraux," Yates began, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his gaze. "When you first arrived in Linden, standing in front of that empty house, I thought you were the most beautiful, most courageous woman I'd ever seen. And every day since then has only confirmed that first impression." He paused, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "I know this isn't what you expected when you came west. I know I'm not the man whose letters brought you here. But I've come to love you with a depth that sometimes frightens me. Your intelligence, your kindness, your determination, your quiet strength, everything about you has become essential to my happiness." He opened the velvet pouch, revealing a delicate band of gold supporting a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "This was my mother's," he explained softly. "My father gave it to her when he asked her to take a chance on building a life with him in a place she'd never seen." Lillian's heart was pounding so hard she wondered if he could hear it in the quiet room. She was acutely aware of the warmth of his hands around hers, the earnestness in his storm-gray eyes, the significance of this moment that would forever divide her life into before and after. "I'm asking you to take a similar chance," Yates continued. "Not on a place you've already embraced Linden and this life with more courage than I could have imagined, but on me, on us. On building something together that neither of us anticipated, but that feels more right than anything I've ever known." He drew a deep breath. "Lillian Deveraux, will you marry me?" For a moment, Lillian couldn't speak, overwhelmed by emotion. When she had agreed to come west as Jacob Wells's bride, it had been a practical decision as much as a romantic one, a calculated risk for a different, potentially better life. What Yates was offering was something else entirely, a partnership based on genuine knowledge of each other, on feelings that had developed naturally despite unusual circumstances, on shared values and complementary dreams. "Yes," she whispered, tears spilling freely now. "Yes, Yates Porter, I will marry you." The joy that transformed his face was something Lillian knew she would remember for the rest of her life, pure, unguarded happiness that erased the weariness and worry of the past days. With hands that trembled slightly, Yates slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if it had been made for her. Then he was rising, pulling her to her feet and into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left no doubt about the depth of his feelings. Lillian returned the embrace with equal fervor, all the love she had been holding carefully in check, now free to express itself fully. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Yates rested his forehead against hers in what had become a familiar, cherished gesture of intimacy between them. "I love you," he said simply, the words holding all the certainty that had been in his proposal. "And I love you," Lillian replied, the words feeling both monumental and completely natural. "Not because you rescued me when I arrived, or because you've helped me establish myself here, though I'm grateful for both, but because of who you are. Because somewhere along the way, you became essential to my happiness too." They spent the rest of the evening by the fire, making plans for their future together. Yates was adamant that Lillian should continue with the school. "Linden needs a teacher even more than I need a wife," he insisted, though his smile belied the sacrifice implied by his words. They discussed living arrangements, whether Lillian would move to Yates's larger home, or if he would join her at the homestead that had been Jacob's parting gift to her. "We could split our time," Yates suggested. "The ranch needs daily attention, but this place—" He looked around the small, cozy house that Lillian had gradually made her own. "This place has meaning for both of us. We could use it as a retreat, Or perhaps later, when the school is well established, you might want a place closer to town for the winter months when travel is difficult. The practical considerations when to marry, how to manage their respective responsibilities, what changes would be necessary to their daily lives occupied their conversation. But beneath the logistics ran a current of joy and anticipation that made even mundane details seem significant and precious. As the evening grew late, and Yates reluctantly prepared to leave, propriety still demanded certain appearances be maintained. Especially with their engagement so new, he paused at the door, drawing Lillian close once more. "When I first saw you standing in front of this empty house," he said softly, "I thought to myself, she's filled it just by standing there. I had no idea then how completely you would fill my life too." The words, so simple yet so profound, brought fresh tears to Lillian's eyes. "That might be the most beautiful thing anyone has ever said to me," she whispered, reaching up to touch his face, tracing the strong lines that had become so dear to her. Yates turned his head to press a kiss into her palm. "Get used to it," he murmured against her skin. "I plan to spend the rest of our lives telling you exactly how much you mean to me." News of their engagement spread quickly through Linden, met with general approval and some good-natured teasing about the circuitous route that had brought them together. Rebecca was particularly delighted, confessing that she had suspected their feelings for each other almost from the beginning. "The way Yates looked at you when he thought no one was watching," she explained as she helped Lillian prepare invitations for their wedding, planned for the first weekend in February after the school term was well underway. "Like you were some kind of miracle he couldn't quite believe was real." Christmas in Linden proved to be a joyous affair, with the entire community gathering for the children's pageant, a great success under Lillian's guidance, followed by a feast in the town meeting hall. Yates and Lillian attended together, their newly acknowledged relationship adding an extra layer of happiness to the celebration. "Next Christmas, we'll host at the ranch," Yates murmured as they watched the children receiving small gifts from a Santa Claus portrayed by the town's blacksmith. "Invite everyone who doesn't have family nearby. Make it a tradition." The casual inclusion of her in his future plans, the easy assumption of a shared life stretching before them, filled Lillian with a quiet contentment she had never expected to find when she boarded that eastbound train in Philadelphia just a few months earlier. January brought the official opening of Linden's school, with 15 students ranging in age from 6 to 16 enrolled for the first term. Lillian approached her teaching duties with enthusiasm and dedication, quickly establishing herself as a respected figure in the community. Yates supported her completely, often arranging his ranch responsibilities to allow him to escort her to and from town during the worst of the winter weather. As their February wedding approached, preparations accelerated. Lillian worked with a seamstress in Helena to create a simple but elegant wedding gown. Yates, with typical thoughtfulness, arranged for Lillian's closest friend from Philadelphia, a fellow teacher named Alina, to travel west for the ceremony, knowing how much it would mean to have someone from her former life witness the beginning of her new one. The wedding itself, held in Linden's small church on a crisp February afternoon, reflected the couple's journey, elements of Eastern tradition blending seamlessly with Western practicality. Lillian wore her mother's lace veil with her new gown. Yates had a new suit made but paired it with the boots he wore every day on the ranch. The church was decorated with pine boughs and winter berries gathered by Lillian's students, who attended en masse, their excitement adding to the festive atmosphere. Reverend Simmons, who had become one of Lillian's strongest supporters in the community, performed the ceremony with evident pleasure. When he pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that rose from the assembled guests nearly lifted the roof of the small building. The celebration afterward, held in the town meeting hall, lasted well into the evening. There was music from local musicians, dancing, abundant food and drink, and speeches from friends both old and new. Through it all, Yates rarely left Lillian's side, his pride and happiness evident in every glance, every touch, every smile directed at his new wife. As the festivities wound down, the couple prepared to depart for their honeymoon, a 2-week stay in Helena at the finest hotel, Yates's wedding gift to Lillian. Before they left, they found a quiet moment alone on the porch of the meeting hall, gazing up at the star-filled Montana sky. Happy? Yates asked, his arm around Lillian's waist, drawing her close against the February chill. Completely, she assured him, leaning into his embrace. And you, more than I ever thought possible, he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. When my father sent for me to come west, I thought I was giving up my future. Instead, I was heading toward it, toward you. Lillian turned in his arms, reaching up to touch the face that had become so beloved to her. I came west seeking security, a practical partnership with a man I knew only through letters. What I found instead was love, real, unexpected, and more wonderful than anything I could have imagined. When you arrived to an empty house that day, Yates said softly, I had no idea how completely you would fill my life. As they shared a tender kiss beneath the vast Montana sky, surrounded by the community that had embraced them both, Lillian reflected on the strange, winding path that had led her to this moment. What had begun with disappointment and deception had transformed into something beautiful, and true a love story neither of them had anticipated, but that now defined their lives in ways that made all the uncertainty worthwhile. And in the years that followed, as they built their life together, running the ranch, supporting the school, eventually welcoming children of their own into a home filled with love and laughter, Lillian often thought of that first day in Linden, standing before an empty house with no idea of the happiness waiting to be discovered. The mail-order bride who had arrived expecting one life had found another, infinitely richer one instead. And the cowboy who had greeted her with regret and apology had become the center of a world she couldn't imagine living without. Life in Montana Territory was never easy. There were harsh winters, difficult seasons on the ranch, challenges at the school as Linden grew and changed with the coming of the railroad and new settlers. But through it all, Yates and Lillian faced each day together, their partnership strengthened by the unusual circumstances that had brought them together and the love that had grown from the most unexpected beginnings. When people asked how they met as new residents of Linden, often did Yates would smile that still made Lillian's heart skip, and say simply, "She arrived as a mail-order bride to an empty house. I told her she'd filled it just by standing there." And Lillian would add with a loving glance at her husband, "And he filled my life just by being himself." It wasn't the story either of them had set out to write, but it was theirs, authentic, imperfect, and more beautiful than any romance either could have imagined when fate and circumstance brought them together on that autumn day in Linden, Montana Territory, 1878.